Today we're going to be graphing the sine function. So one thing we can use to help us graph this is we can think about the unit circle. So remember at the unit circle right here at 0 radians, our point is 1, 0. Here our point is 0, 1, and that is at pi halves radians. At pi radians, our point is -1, 0, and at 3 pi over 2, our point is 0, -1. This is y is equal to sine of theta, and it's in the form y is equal to a times the sine of b theta. A tells you the amplitude, which is how high or how low the graph goes, and b tells you the number of cycles there are between 0 and 2 pi. So we can see that our amplitude is 1. So our highest our graph goes is 1, the lowest our graph goes is -1. And then using our unit circle, we can say, okay, when x is 0, right, 0 radians, the sine is 0, so we're going to start right there at that point, 0, 0. Okay, next, because we're graphing from 0 to 2 pi. And then right here we have pi. Here we're going to have half of a pi. Here we're going to have 3 pi over 2. So we need to say, what is the sine at pi over 2? Well, at pi over 2, sine is second, so the sine is 1. All right, at pi sine is second, so the sine is 0. At 3 pi over 2, sine is second, so it's -1. And at 2 pi, sine is second, so it's 0. So graph of sine is going to look like this, okay? So that's one full cycle. Okay, and that's just how we would typically graph just a normal y equals sine of theta graph. Now, on number 1, so remember the amplitude is your A, so here your amplitude is 2. And to find your period is just 2 pi divided by b. Your period, what the period means is the period is the horizontal distance it takes to complete one full cycle. Because some of these we're going to have many cycles, some of these we're only going to have maybe half of a cycle. So we know that we are going to have one full cycle. So what we could do is we can say this is 2, here we have -2. Since we have one full cycle, we could just go ahead and sketch what we know one full cycle will look like. We know we start at 0, and we know the period is 2 pi. So then we have to divide this up into we're going to divide each cycle into 4s, okay? So 2 pi divided by 4 is equal to pi halves. So we're going to divide this into 4, so we're dividing it in half here, and then in fourths. So we'd start here at pi over 2. And next would be 2 pi over 2, which is just pi, and then 3 pi over 2. And then right here we would have 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. Okay, on number 2, A is 2, so our amplitude is 2 again. And this means we're going to have 2 cycles. Since B is 2, that means we're going to have 2 cycles. So we can go ahead and sketch 2 cycles. 1 cycle, and then, oops, I should have gone a little higher there, 2 cycles. This should look more, this should look equal. It's just the way I've graphed it. So this is from 0 to 2 pi. So we're dividing each of these cycles into 4 parts. So if this is 2 pi, this has to be pi. Now from pi, and our period, remember our period is 2 pi divided by, our 2 pi divided by b, and here b is 2. So our period is pi. What that means is that every pi we're going to have one cycle. Here we had one cycle every 2 pi. But here we're going to have one cycle every pi. So we need to divide each of these cycles into 4 pieces. So I'm going to divide pi into 4. So we're going to be counting by pi over 4. And I'm going to divide this cycle into 4 pieces. So there's one piece, and divide that in half. So this would be pi halves. And this is half of pi halves, which is pi over 4. So 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, which is pi halves. This is 3 pi over 4. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to divide this into 4 sections. 1, so you see that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So we go 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4. This is going to be 5 pi over 4. Okay, this is 6 pi over 4, and 6 pi over 4 is the same as 3 pi over 2. So 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, this is 7 pi over 4. Okay, and that would be the graph of that one. Number 3 and number 4, the same thing. They're almost exactly like... Number 3 is almost exactly like number 2. You just have a different amplitude. And number 4 is exactly like number 1. You just have a different amplitude. Okay, but I do want to do one like number 5. Let me move this really fast so I can give myself a little bit more room. Okay, on number 5, the amplitude is still 2. And the period, remember to find the period, it's 2 pi. Divided by b, and here b is going to be 4. So our period is pi halves. Now, when it says it has 4 cycles, that means we are going to have 4 of these, okay? So let me draw that really fast. Now, the difference between when our A value is positive and when A is negative is when it's positive, it would go up. But when it's negative, it's going to go down. So we're going to have 1 cycle, 2 cycles, 3 cycles, and I'm going to have to extend this, 4 cycles. And we know that we're graphing from 0 to 2 pi. Okay, so this is where the first cycle ends. This is where the second cycle ends. This is where the third cycle ends. Do you guys see that? 1, 2, 3, 4. So the period, we said the period is pi halves, right? So right here, this is pi halves. And then remember, we have to divide each cycle into 4s. So I'm going to divide it in half and then in half again. This cycle I'll divide it in half and then half again. This cycle I divide it in half and then half again. This cycle I'll divide it in half and then half again. So every pi over 2 is 1 cycle. So that's pi over 2. This would be 2 pi over 2, which is just pi. And this would be 3 pi over 2. And then remember, we're going to divide each cycle into 4. So if we take pi over 2 and we divide that by 4, remember when we divide by a fraction, it's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal, and the reciprocal of 4 is 1/4, so that's pi eighths. So that means we'll start at 0, and this is pi over 8. This would be 2 pi over 8, which is pi over 4. This is 3 pi over 8. Now that's 4 pi over 8, which is just pi halves. Right here we have 5 pi over 8. This is 6 pi over 8, and 6 pi over 8 is the same as 3 pi over 2. I'm sorry, 3 pi over 4. So 6 pi over 8, this is 7 pi over 8. I'm just going to draw an arrow because I'm running out of room. I'm trying to write sideways. Okay, and 8 pi over 8, which is just pi. Right here we have 9 pi over 8. This is 10 pi over 8, and 10 pi over 8 is 5 pi over 4. Um, 9 pi over 8, 10 pi over 8. Right here we have 11 pi over 8. I'm going to draw an arrow there. 12 pi over 8, and 12 pi over 8 simplifies to 3 pi over 2. Right here we have 13 pi over 8. This is 14 pi over 8, and 14 pi over 8 is the same as 7. 14 pi over 8 would be 7 pi over 4. 13, 14. Right here is 15 pi over 8. And then we would go to 16 pi over 8, which is just 2 pi. So this would be your graph. It's a little jumbled there. You guys are welcome to draw this on another piece of paper. Make sure you have all the room that you need. Now on number 6, the amplitude is 3. Okay, and the period is 2 pi divided by b, which is 1/2. And remember, when we divide by a fraction, it's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So our period here is 4 pi. Now, this means we only have half of a cycle. So remember, if this is what one cycle looks like, that means we're only looking at half of a cycle. So we're only looking at this. It's just half of a cycle. Okay? And typically, if we have one cycle, we'll break it up into 4 parts. So if we only have half a cycle, we're only going to break it up into 2 parts. So we know this is 2 pi. I forgot the amplitude is here. And we divide 2 pi by 2, and that just gives us pi here. Okay,